Thank you, Cornelius. Thank you so much, Roshi Joan, for being with us today. It's always wonderful to talk to you in any context, and we're grateful at Mind and Life Europe to have you here with us at our Friends webinar. And I have a few questions that are kind of wide-ranging, and I thought I'd kind of jump right in with standing at the edge, because we took that as kind of the banner of this particular conversation, and I hope there'll be more. And I'd also like to welcome, by the way, everybody who came online to see us today. It's great that you could be with us today. So let's jump right in with Standing at the Edge, which is the name of, I think, your most recent book. And in this book, you developed the idea of edge states as a tool to explore the qualities of mind that are necessary to be a balanced and good carer and have a balanced relationship with oneself and others. And you draw greatly on your own experience as a social activist, as a caregiver, and as one who sits with the dying in hospice care. You give us in this book a really extraordinarily nuanced phenomenology of the complexities of states like altruism, empathy, integrity, and respect. Would you like to give us some information or elaborate a little bit on the idea of what is an edge state? How do you define this? And I guess one of the points maybe that is interesting about the edge state is you put it in your book, they're paradoxical. The subtitle of the book is Where Fear and Courage Meet. So I'd love to hear more about your definition and your thoughts, and perhaps also how you discovered edge states in your life.
Thank you, Amy. And it's wonderful. I see Leslie and Perla, in addition to Amy, up on the panorama of participants. I'm not looking at the whole participant panorama, but I'm just grateful to be here. And you're in Minebra, and I came down the mountain from Prussian Mountain Forest Refuge, which is up at, let's see, 9,400 feet or 3,000 meters, where I'm living now in quarantine. And I'm in El Valle in the house of William Du Bois, who's a very renowned writer. And so I sort of arranged his little writing studio so you could see the skull on my left-hand shoulder, so to speak, keeping in mind and heart the truth of impermanence. So Amy, as you know, I've been practicing Buddhism since the mid-1960s, and as well have been involved in activities related to social transformation since that time. In America at that time, the really outstanding issues that were visible to us with the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in relation to Vietnam. And that spirit has carried me for decades, for which I am grateful. And it brought me also into close work with dying people, but also encountering this world of human rights, people in human rights organizations, lawyers who are involved in the issues of protection of marginalized people, encountering and interacting deeply with teachers, and of course, healthcare providers. Also, politicians and CEOs. And on the other side of the equation, people who are subject to structural violence, people who are in communities on the margins of society, who are subjected to profound social injustice. So in these many decades of my work, and also of encountering others who serve in disenfranchised conditions, including in the medical system, I noticed consistently that the very virtuous qualities and processes that give foundation or substrate to this kind of work of service and care had a shadow side, and that it affected the quality of care that individuals could engage in. And if you take pathological altruism as an example, I have a big section on altruism and how important altruism is just for anyone. You and I are alive because of the altruism of our parents. You know, I'm wondering about the feedback. Let's see. Maybe everyone can mute just while I'm talking and then unmute when they talk. So in this work of interacting with healthcare providers and many, what I saw was that there, and also in myself, Amy, that there are important human qualities that are about survival and well-being, that are really conditions that can enhance deep flourishing, but in their shadow expression can cause profound damage. And I realize that, you know, we're right on that edge. You know, if we're not fully altruistic, like 80% altruistic, so to speak, that's not altruism. But if we're altruistic at the point where we're harming ourselves, harming others, harming the institutions that we're serving in, or harming the institutions or countries which we're serving, that moves over the edge into what's pathological altruism. And so the qualities that you named, which are actually processes, not qualities, include altruism, empathy, integrity, respect, and engagement. And these were the most frequent experiences that people shared with me in terms of their challenge of meeting their expectation of what it is to be a healthy altruist, or what it is to be in a connection, resonance with someone that they were serving, but not overwhelmed. That is empathy, or is it empathic distress? Now, one of the points of the book, Amy, which I think is really important, is that all of us fall over the edge to greater or lesser degrees. And there are two things that I think were really important discoveries I made through the experience of others and my own experience. And that is the medium of transformation out of these shadow states is compassion. And as you know, the last third of the book is a deep dive into compassion. We don't have time to go into it in this short interview, but it's not the fuzzy-wuzzy compassion that looks more like sympathy. Compassion has a blazing quality to it in terms of its the process of being able to see deeply into reality. And of course, it includes the aspiration to transform suffering and hopefully the actions that can address suffering and transform suffering. But it is to understand that the compassion is the means for transforming these shadow conditions into strengths. And that also going over the edge and coming back into the high edge of any of these edge states is about the development of moral character. So that's the short take on it. But I really thank you for that question, because at this time, and this is a global situation that we're facing, not only in terms of the pandemic, not only in terms of political churn, but also our climate catastrophe. And we need to have strong legs on which to stand, or a strong sense of imperative, profoundly grounded moral character in order to meet the challenges of our time, including the rise of fascism, which is being experienced in my own country and in other parts of the world.
You left me speechless. No, I was muted. Thank you very much for that answer, Roshi. The way you express yourself evokes some of the things I was reading recently in some of your work. Just some of your expressions are so exquisite. For example, I think you just described what, talking about we fall off and we have to do the work to get back on this edge. Use the phrase working the edge to expand its boundaries, in either being with dying and or standing at the edge, perhaps even with both. And I think that's a beautiful image of expanding the edge so as to have a footing. Or you also use two expressions that I just love, and I would love for you to kind of explicate them a little bit, which is being a wooden puppet.
Oh.
And fishing with a straight hook.
Okay. Well,
so maybe you could be teaching with those two, because they're such fantastic images. Okay. And I think that they follow up from what you just said about this practice of compassion.
Yeah. So these are Zen tropes. And as Zen tropes, I also, I included those tropes in my book because I love them too. So the notion of wooden puppet is related to the image or the role of the bodhisattva. That is, the wooden puppet is pulled by the strings of suffering. His or her actions are in response to suffering, but there's no self there, if you will. What is evoking the action of the wooden puppet, if you will, of the bodhisattva, of the compassionate one, is actually the suffering of the world. And so it's not as if there's a self or an other, there's simply this seamless responsiveness. And I really, I like that image because, at first there's a sort of, I'm not sure. There's a kind of twinge of aversion because nobody wants to be a wooden puppet. But it's a trope, I think, that points toward egolessness. And also that the second trope, fishing with a straight hook, also is related to the wooden puppet image. It means that we have no attachment to outcome. That there is a kind of openness. We're not trying to, the person who goes around with a big bodhisattva button on their shirt or proclaims themselves as a world caregiver is maybe, has a little bit of work, personal work to do. It is more that we simply drop the hook that is a straight hook into the waters of life, and not with the aim of catching anything. So that's from the absolute perspective, if you will. From the relative perspective, our deep commitment to end suffering in this world, which becomes instantiated in our subjective experience through practice or through living by vow, where we articulate internally our intention, or we recall it in our community in terms of intention. That begins to, if you will, open up the marrow of our lives to our fundamental unselfishness. So both of these tropes point toward a wooden puppet is basically unselfish. It simply responds to the pull of suffering. Fishing with a straight hook, it's not the ego driving towards something. From the point of view of the absolute, it is simply dropping that hook into the waters of life with no attachment to outcome. Now, I know from working with many caregivers, there's a very big challenge with this notion of not being attached to outcome. And actually, Christiana Figueres, who was the architect of the Paris Climate Accord, she really objected to that notion. But, you know, when we were discussing this notion, it was really about, you know, you get yourself out of the way and you open up to the world as it is, and you're in an unmediated, responsive state to things just as they are, not driven by self, not driven by ego.
Not outcome driven. So this brings us another question that comes up often in your work that's I guess related, and you speak about this a lot actually when you're speaking in your earlier book, Being With God, and that's the necessity of cultivating not knowing. And I guess beginner's mind, you could say. Can you talk to us a little bit about what it's like to train the mind in not knowing? I guess that's related to not expecting. It's also related to something, another expression of yours that I really love. I think it's when you're talking about the wooden puppet, you say she's a radical optimist. She has no expectations.
So this is a really wonderful question, Amy. I'm not so sure we can directly train ourselves in not knowing, but you know, there's this notion of using a thorn to remove a thorn. And it's particularly challenging, I think, for those of us in Western culture where there's such a value on knowing, on facticity, on research, on data. Our identities are so wrapped up in the control that we experience as people who know. And yet, years ago, I made this distinction between, you know, what is a wise person and what is a smart person. Mm-hmm. The vice president, when I was thinking about that at the time, it was some years ago, we had a vice president of our country who was really smart, and he lacked wisdom. That, I think, is really an interesting formulation to explore. So from the point of view of not knowing, this is, so much can be said, you know, and of course it's in a way antithetical to language. I like what Bob Thurman, who did a translation of the Vimalakirti Sutta, and he called it a tolerance for the inconceivable. So I love that expression, a tolerance for the inconceivable. We feel so secure in what we know, and yet look what just happened. This pandemic took over our world. Wow. Few of us anticipated it. And so what kind of individual can respond to the pandemic? And not knowing doesn't mean being stupid. It actually means being present in the sense of in the present moment and responsive to the present moment as it is. And you mentioned a wonderful term from Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, beginner's mind. How do you keep yourself open to things just as they are, without conceptuality mediating, coloring your experience, your perceptions? And so what practice does is it really allows one to stabilize one's attention so that one's capacity to perceive things in the present moment is much more clear. That's one thing.
Mm-hmm. That was actually one of my questions. You already, I mean, of course, it's on all of our minds, what we're going through, what planet is going through now with COVID, and also you mentioned with the ecological disasters that are happening. And so the way you would see, the question has to do with how do you see, how would you teach us to be in this time or react in this time as, how can you see not just individuals, but societies and cultures in the context of what we're living in such a powerful way, individually and collectively? Much harder to get the collective vision, you know, to hold the collective vision. It's something you've done all your life in your activism, but how do you move from the individual to, or what would the training or what would the idea be in moving from an individual to to broaden our edge of engagement, our capacity to think in terms of collectivity as opposed to just individually?
I think one of the disciplines that I have deep appreciation for is the discipline that we call, at least in our country, complex adaptive systems. It's being able to see things from a systems perspective. And a systems perspective is fundamentally a Buddhist perspective. And we would perhaps use the term Praticca Samuppada, which, you know, points to interconnectedness, interdependence, and interpenetration. And we begin to understand also from Francisco's work, Vis-a-vis in Action, that our very systems that govern our life and that affect the views of those who are inside those systems can be the context of extreme structural violence. And that is to say, to create ethos or create conditioned views which are basically violent, alienated, and cause immense suffering. So this comes back to understand, to the understanding that our practice or how we are with each other is about expanding our subjectivity to include all beings and things. To Shantideva said, you know, it's like if you're walking and a thorn penetrates your foot, your hand doesn't ask permission to remove the thorn. There's this sense, it's one body. And that we share, if you will, it's not just a common humanity that we share, but it's the realization that we share a common life with all species and things. And this is not just a conceptual notion, it is really through our lived experience. And we can feel it now profoundly in terms of the climate catastrophe that we're in. Part of our lived and living organism is the very atmosphere of our lives, which includes the physical atmosphere surrounding this earth that animates our body. And it's seeing things from a more interconnected perspective, an interdependent perspective. We begin to realize, you know, the right hand pulls the thorn from the foot, not asking permission, but to realize we share a common humanity, or we share a common body of life. And we have to take care of each other because it's taking care of ourselves. And Joanna Macy, who's a very extraordinary socially engaged Buddhist in her 90s, real visionary who has a prophetic voice, you know, makes this so clear in her work. I think Greta Thunberg at the other end of the age continuum, she sees it so clearly from the point of view of she's going to have to live in the future that we are cultivating, fostering, or growing now. So it's time and space.
Right, that's a beautiful integration of inaction, and I have just been getting to know recently, thanks to a great degree to seeing her on your Upaya program, Joanna Macy's older work, which is really visionary. And in fact, I don't know if she and Francisco Varela knew each other, but they should have if they didn't, because they're clearly brother and sister. Francisco's like to use the word enaction to describe, as you just said, to describe this interconnectedness. He used the metaphor of a dance very often. And I discovered another wonderful image in your book. I think it was being in that, the jeweled net, which is
the
just
jeweled net of Indra. Yeah.
Right, which is just a fabulous, I don't know, maybe you could just tell us about what it is. You know, each node is a jewel, each jewel is multifaceted, and each multifacet reflects all the other jewels in the net, making of the net one jewel, which is just a beautiful way also to think about interconnectedness.
And also, this image, Amy, is one of the main tropes of renown, if you will, in the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Flower Garland Sutra. And what is fascinating is not only this kind of interconnectedness that you're describing, but also a net is not a net, save for the empty spaces of the net. In other words, it's a powerful image that not only points toward interconnectedness. This is, you know, how the jewels reflect the light of each other, but also there are the strands of the net, and then there's the empty space of the net. And it's the integration, if you will, of the relative and the absolute.
So it's an image of groundlessness as well.
Yeah.
Interconnectedness. I think that we just heard a bell. I think that means that you're going to have some questions and answers. I had a lot more questions, but maybe you'll come back.
Amy?
Yes.
I'll just come in here. The bell is the 5-minute bell. So
the bell is
it's a 5-minute bell. So you have you can have maybe one more question.
I'm very bad at reading the little messages that come in because I'm thinking about what Roshi's saying. So since we do have time for another, I have a few questions, but maybe since we've brought up Francisco's work, I could just say that, you know, maybe not many people know, but you're one of his very oldest friends. You were on the scene together in the 70s, I think. And you were one of the first people to be involved in the Mind and Life Institute when Francisco Varela got it started with the Dalai Lama and Adam Engel. And I just wondered if you have any stories or you'd like to tell us a bit about of course, as Cornelius said, you've been dedicated up until now, including within Life Europe, for which we're extraordinarily grateful. But I was kind of wondering if you had anything to say about Francisco was very much an edge thinker, if we want to stay in the edge metaphor, and a thinker of edge. And you've kind of already responded to that, but I wondered if you'd have anything you'd like to say more about that. And perhaps like to mention that your work at Upaya with what was the Zen Brain Symposium, and it's now the Varela Symposium, is really continuing with many of the people who worked in the beginning and have worked all along in this flow of inaction and of complex dynamical systems. And you're actually carrying and housing that space as Mind and Life Europe is. So I'm wondering if you had anything you'd like to say about Francisco and you and Mind and Life.
Well, I as you were speaking, I was remembering in 1981, he and I attended a conference at Stanford University in Palo Alto that was on order and disorder. And Kenneth Arrow presented a very interesting perspective. Kenneth Arrow was a Nobel laureate in the field of economics, and Ilya Prigogine was also there, the chemist. And I remember Francisco and I sitting, you know, in that audience listening to these extraordinary men and women present in this conference, presenting from different disciplines, from the humanities, chemistry, economics, and so forth. And it was really in the context of that conference where we ginned up this notion of an exchange between neuroscientists and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the order-disorder rubric was in part, I think, very instructive for where we are right now. It came, you know, in relation to understanding the processes of complex adaptive systems. And one of the, if you will, dynamics that particularly interested me around order and disorder is that, you know, systems can break down. And if they learn from the breakdown process, they can reorganize themselves at a higher level of complexity and functionality. And it was so staggering for me, that perspective. So I wanted to bring that a little notion, because it really was like an arrow to the heart, if you will. It really penetrated me in terms of positive disintegration. So that was one piece of that conference. But the other piece was, you know, how people from different disciplines can enhance depth of field of understanding when they interact with each other. And this, of course, was reflected in the Lindisfarne Fellowship, of which Sir Francisco and I were both members of Lindisfarne. Yesterday, I had a wonderful, long conversation with Evan Thompson. His father, William Irwin Thompson, was the founder of Lindisfarne. And it was the same notion of this kind of consort of people from various disciplines and ways of life that allows us to see, excuse me, see our reality with greater depth of field. So from, you know, Lindisfarne to Stanford, and then this aha, excuse me, that Cisco and I had in, I'm going to have a drink of water, excuse me. In 1981, I think it was. So that, I think, is the sort of moment when Mind and Life came into being as a notion. I'm going to have a good cough.
Oh. Well, it's very interesting to me that we're ending, you mentioned earlier, we're ending on you mentioned earlier, which is this notion of control and mastery. And here we've moved to the end, we're talking about interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and what it takes actually to listen to someone who just comes from a very different area of expertise than the one, say, you come from. And we have a little card at Mind and Life Europe. We have 8 values. And one of them is standing at the edge. And it is, there you go. And it is, for each value, we had the thought about, you know, a little idea of what, obviously they can be thought of in multiple different, polysemically, in multiple different ways. But on this one, we've written, dare to welcome the unknown with open mind. And then a phrase that Francisco loved, and he always used to say this, expect surprises. And we also, which is kind of a paradox, but he liked those things. And then we have a little quote, which, this is the only card when the quote isn't from Francisco, it's from Sakni Rinpoche, who gave an interview, which I thought was just amazing, for Franz Reichley about Mind and Life and his participation when he was young. And he was talking about how, so here's a master of meditation, talking about listening to scientists. And he said, when I was listening to the scientists, they bashed my ego. I didn't know what they were talking about. And then he said, interdisciplinary work is the best antidote for the arrogant ego. So this is our Mind and Life Standing at the Edge card. And I think maybe we can end there with some thanks to you again.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll come back for the rest of the questions, and we'll let you take over for the Q&A, Cornelius.
Yes, thank you, Amy. Thank you so much for these wonderful questions. I hope my internet connection is stable enough. So far, so good. And thank you, Roshi, Joan, for these wonderful answers. I wish we had hours and hours to talk. But because we don't, I'm going to combine two questions into one. And there are a number of them still to come. And the question would be, in your view, is compassion contagious? In other words, can it spread, can it ripple out into a community? And related to that is, can compassion be understood as an emotion, or is it more like a state of being? Do you have some thoughts?
Well, that's a wonderful, those are two wonderful questions. First of all, in relation to contagion, there's some pretty interesting work in this area about the contagious nature of compassion. And, you know, for example, Jonathan Haidt at the University of Virginia has done, I think, valuable research in looking at compassion, how perceiving an act of compassion or being with a person who is compassionate actually elevates you, as well as potentially elevating those whom are being served. So, and also that in Jonathan Haidt's work, it's so clear that compassion inspires you to be, witnessing compassion inspires you to be compassionate. And then James Fowler at Harvard says clearly in his research, acts of kindness, acts of compassion beget more acts of compassion in a kind of chain reaction of goodness. And I think that, you know, when we, for example, think about contemporary social figures of transformation, Malala is a powerful example of, or Greta Thunberg, young women who have at great risk, in the case of Malala, to her life, Greta Thunberg sending her voice in the world, magnetizing young people all over the globe, simply through the courage to speak truth to power around issues of harm, and also being role models for all of us. My associate Jane Fonda, the actress, really started her environmental work in our country because of Greta Thunberg. So it's, you know, here's Jane in her 80s, Greta, a teenager, and Jane said, I saw what she was doing and I could not respond. So it's a great question. Then the second question that you brought up, Cornelius, I think is important. We often see compassion in a certain fuzzy way, you know, it's just one thing. But one of the things that I did was to create a heuristic map of compassion, basically with the contention that compassion is composed of non-compassion elements. And those elements include attention. And I entered into a kind of thought experiment where I asked myself, is compassion possible without attentional balance, without being able to perceive things clearly. Clearly, compassion is not possible without that. Or is compassion possible without an altruistic or unselfish motivation, which is basically pro-social? Compassion is not possible without prosociality. And then I ask myself, is compassion possible without insight? And in looking at my own experience and of literally the thousands of interviews I've done around the experience of compassion, clearly insight is required for compassion to be present. And then I ask myself, is compassion possible without some sense of embodiment? You know, I'm not saying necessarily physical embodiment, but I'm speaking about without the intention to relieve suffering, which is pointing toward action. So Stephen Hawking, for example, in looking at his life, spoke often to compassion, often was compassionate. And clearly this sense of not physicality, but the sense of physical engagement at some level is essential. And then I realized, Cornelius, that it was rather challenging, at least from the Western perspective, to train people who were very self-centered and, you know, in conventional compassion. But we could train individuals in the different components of compassion, and looking at, from the point of view of looking at compassion as a complex dynamical system, and that these suite of features, when interacting together, can produce or give rise to the emergent process of compassion. So that, I think, is a, you know, it's an unusual perspective, but I think it's not misaligned with what researchers in social psychology have learned about compassion, and it certainly is very aligned with the Buddhist perspective. Compassion is a complex dynamical process or system that is an emergent process arising out of non-compassion elements.
Excellent. Extremely helpful, Roshi. Thank you so much for that, you know, that complete and very helpful response. Roshi, there's a lot of interest, I think, from the participants to better understand and maybe learn more, go a little deeper into the term that you used, a tolerance for the inconceivable, particularly if the inconceivable has to do with atrocities. So inconceivable atrocities in the world that we've seen in many different contexts, shall we say, and settings. How can we kind of look at different aspects and better understand this idea of tolerance for the inconceivable?
I think the word that we're getting hung up on is tolerance. We are not saying, I don't think when Thurman translated that, he was saying tolerating inconceivable harm at all. Actually, a tolerance of the inconceivable means that we are not bypassing, we are not in denial about what is arising in this very moment. So that's what I believe that is reflected in this term. It's not about tolerating harm. It actually means having the courage to witness, to bear witness, to not separate from, not be a bystander, and also not be in the bubble of moral apathy, but to actually have the courage to bear witness to what is arising in this moment, including the most egregious harm. And I can say this is really important at this time. We can get lost in addictive behaviors. We can get lost in moral outrage. We can find ourselves subject to profound moral injury and become psychologically fundamentally disabled, right now, we have to have the stability to be able to open ourselves to exactly what is happening.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. That's I think a critical clarification for the way we can relate to that. Again, for those of you who would like still to ask a question, you could do so best in the chat. I know, Amy, you have a couple of questions you weren't able to slip in, and whilst some people may still write on the chat function, if you have a question that you would urgently still wish to ask Roshi Joan, I think that would be great if you could do that now.
Well, I do actually have a question. It's maybe not urgent, but you mentioned in the very beginning about your long timeline in social activism and then in the contemplative life. And I think one of the things that concerns a lot of the people involved in Mind and Life Europe is how to work the edge of being a scientist and a contemplative. There's a paradox there. You know, a paradox that we've evoked when we talked about mastery and knowing versus open beginner's mind and not knowing. There are also two extremely different lifestyles, and it would be interesting just to hear you on this. How would you say, maybe life balance?
You know, I remember I was in a meeting with the Mind and Life Institute in their Summer Research Institute when a young neuroscientist stood up and basically said, the question is, why are you a scientist? And he said, well, I just want to know things. And I said, well, why do you want to know things? Well, I'm just curious. And I realized there was a kind of cognitive dissonance that I experienced in his attitude, which he expressed in a sort of a kind of casual and slightly disdaining way. And it was very different how he presented himself than how Francisco presented himself. I feel that Francisco had instantiated an ethos where the value of non-harming was at the very center of things. And, you know, through our friendship, I began to have a very different view of the role science can play, which is science that is directed toward liberating all beings from suffering. That is a basic bodhisattva attitude, not just out of the delight of curiosity, of figuring out a puzzle, but which is kind of fun, but that has a deeper level of aspiration. And so in the name of science, but also in the name of religion, a lot of harm has happened. And I think reinstantiating a moral perspective that is not self-righteous, but really has to do with, in a certain way, coming out of the teachings of the Buddha, of Jesus, Muhammad, where non-harming is the most, if you will, gives gravity and direction toward what we're doing, whether we're a scientist or contemplative. I also feel that contemplative practice itself deeply enhances the scientific process. In other words, it allows one to see things systemically in a much wider view. And I think that Francisco's science was based not only on his Buddhist practice, but also on his deep study and investigation of phenomenology, both at the intellectual level and also in terms of investigating his own lived experience. And it made his science rich and deep And we are turning toward his science all the time.
Yes, thank you. That's beautiful. And we too at Mind and Life Europe are working on keeping both the contemplative side or the phenomenological side or the nourishing the mind side in a good way, maybe nourishing it with emptiness, in balance with the knowing mind and the expertise mind. And so there's sort of a balance of the two things that go on, that one feeds the other. So that's a great answer.
I just remembered some words from Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, who said, in the expert's mind, there are very few possibilities, but in the beginner's mind, there are many.
Thank you.
Roshi, in the minute and a half or so that we have left, there's I think an interesting question that's come up, particularly because I think it's a kind of a widespread phenomenon that people are experiencing today, and it has to do with the relationship between fear and the ability to have compassion, and the fear is not the kind of naked, fear of something horrible right in front of us, but it's maybe more related to the uncertainty that we've, for example, with the pandemic. I mean, there's some very strong fears there too, but it's lurking. And to what extent does that prohibit us or stop us from being at the same time able to unfold or develop compassion as a complex dynamic system in the manner you spoke of earlier?
So, fear is related to our experience of the threat to our survival or to the survival of the planet. I'm not against fear. Forgive me. I think it's a wake-up call. I live in the wilderness in a very remote area where there are mountain lion and bear and also hunters. And so, I heard the sound of guns last night. And needless to say, I became alert. And my alertness was, an asset. It was an ally in that moment. I wasn't asleep. So fear allows us to prioritize. So I don't want to turn away from my fear, but I want to understand that it is about a threat to my survival. But we're in a very powerful situation right now, and it is characterized by radical uncertainty. And if there is one thing that the Buddha taught that really came home for me when I started working with dying people, is the truth of impermanence. That any expectation that the moment that is coming, the very next moment that I'm going to survive, that expectation should be liberated immediately. And as such, when you understand the truth of impermanence, you enter into a relationship with your lived experience that is much deeper, often characterized by gratitude. Thank you, Brother David. Appreciation, where you understand that there is nothing that you can count on. And we're in it now. It is such a powerful time. And those who freeze as they encounter this radical shift that we're in right now, wanting things to be different and the same as they were before, are going to suffer even more. And so it's how do we cultivate this capacity to see deeply into the truth of impermanence? How do we learn to live with radical uncertainty? It's quite a gift to even have a little glimpse of it, a taste of it. And now we're getting an opportunity to understand how precious this life is, what our responsibilities are in terms of taking care of our life, how to live in an ethical way, asking for forgiveness if need be, and doing the best that we can to back down this climate catastrophe we're in, and also to cultivate a politics and economy and an economy of peace.
Mm. That's great. In a way, we've almost come full circle, because you started with us an hour ago with a skull on behind your left shoulder as a reminder of the appreciation of impermanence. And the idea of living with radical uncertainty is also a wonderful element, and certainly reminds me to mention to all of the participants here that in a few days, beginning on August 10th, Mind and Life Europe will begin its Summer Research Institute, this year online because of the circumstances. And the theme, also in regard to the events of the last months, is grounding knowledge in uncertainty, and it's really very much compatible, Roshi Joan, with what you've been mentioning, and we want to explore this element of knowledge and uncertainty from many different points of view. So for those of you who haven't yet signed up and might wish to participate, please, you'll find all the information you need on our website. So that's my little plug for our Summer Research Institute. But much more importantly, I would like, on behalf of all of us, Roshi Joan, to thank you so warmly for being with us, sharing an hour of your time and your wisdom and knowledge on standing at the edge and many, many more things. And Amy, for preparing and asking these questions. I know that already, just reading on the chat and what we'll surely receive in the next hours, there's great appreciation for your wisdom and for what you've shared with us. So thank you deeply from the bottom of my heart, and I think our hearts. Roshi Joan.
Thank you,
Amy.
Cornelius and Amy and Nina, Uta, and I'm just so grateful to reconnect with my European family. Truly. Long, deep roots we
Indeed.
share.
Indeed. And we feel the same way to you, our dear friend, Roshi Joan Halifax. Thank you, dear participants, for being with us. And we wish you all the best for a wonderful Saturday summer evening if you're in Europe or elsewhere. And again, thank you both. Thank you all. And goodbye.
Amy La. Bye-bye.